Welcome back to the Changemaker Podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. Today, my guest is Pastor David McDonald. He's originally from South Africa, planted churches all over the world, was a part of an amazing city transformation in Toowoomba, Australia. You're just like the world's most interesting man. But David, welcome.
Welcome to the Changemaker Podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that The Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Thank you so much. So good to be here. It's a blessing to be here.
So you are in town to talk about, I just want to know a little bit about your history. What brought you? You're in Charleston now, but then I do want to get into city transformation, which you were a part of in Toowoomba, Australia.
Well, I grew up in South Africa during probably one of the hardest eras in South Africa's history. Born South African, raised in South Africa, raised in a mining community. My dad was a metallurgist, lived in the mining community, and had a radical encounter. And I'll speak a little bit about my background.
Yeah, please.
Became involved in a political organization called the AWB, which was really a neo-Nazi organization. And as a young man, growing up in an area where there was not a lot for us to do as youngsters.
Yeah.
I joined this thinking, well, I'm really doing God a favor. And unfortunately, the teachers in our educational system used apartheid as a subject. So we were around that discussion all the time. They used it really as propaganda. So by the time you'd finished high school, we all thought every black person, in African person was the enemy. And unfortunately, that was the thinking, and took on that philosophy, which was so terrible, so demonic. And but I'm very thankful. There was a man that used to come out to South Africa called Richard Wurmbrand, and he started a ministry called Martyrs for Christ. Richard Wurmbrand was a man that was tortured for Christ in Russia. And I remember having these big neo-Nazi rallies on the same ground. So that we'd go to the showgrounds, they would have a big rally, we would have a neo-Nazi rally, and it was amazing that I would hear the gospel preached. Never understood the gospel. I grew up in a very, very religious environment, but never heard the gospel preached, never heard anything about salvation, never heard anything about the fact that I could become a son of God, ever. And I think some of those seeds fell into good soil, because in 1990, 1980, I had a radical encounter with God. I was in the military, joined the military to be a mercenary, because in South Africa you could actually join a private army and make a lot of money fighting for different private armies throughout Africa. Every country in Africa had their own little army, and a lot of them were financed by China and Russia. And I thought, well, what a great idea to be a contractor, but really it was a mercenary. And so, and in that season, somebody invited me to church. Just a young man in the base in the military camp said, "Hey, why don't you come to church?" Never been to church, that type of church. Went with him, thinking, man, at least I'll get a free lunch out of this guy. Free lunch out of the base for the day. And I had a radical encounter with God. Literally changed my life. Went to church as a neo-Nazi, walked out of church as a born-again believer, totally changed, had a radical encounter. And that took me on a course. That brought me into a cycle of understanding that for 18 years of my life, I had invested into the kingdom of the enemy.
Yep.
And I made a decision right there and then that I would spend the rest of my life investing into the lives of other young men and bring them into an understanding of God's love, the Father's love. And that was my story. That's how I started into ministry. I made a decision that we don't need to stay orphans. Although I grew up in a home with a mum and dad, I was an orphan.
Yeah.
I had an orphan mentality, didn't understand my identity in God. And so as I grew in God, matured in the things of God, went into full-time ministry in 1991, and have dedicated my life to teach and train young men to walk in their assignment, in their identity, young men and women. Wrote a very, very good book 4 or 5 years ago called A Sonship Revolution, where I speak about Malachi chapter 4, the hearts of the fathers restored back to the sons, the hearts of the sons restored back to the fathers. And it says in that verse, lest I strike that land with a curse. So I think at the end of the day, my heartbeat was to see a transformation in the hearts of our young people, bringing sons and daughters into their assignment and training leaders to understand the importance of next generation leadership.
You know, it's really interesting because there are a lot of people that say, and it's with every generation, I'm Generation X, but say, well, Generation Z is not, they don't have faith. They don't go to church. But I've done a lot of research that is really proving otherwise, that some are saying there's a revival in this generation, but they don't necessarily want denominational church because they want authenticity. And they perceive sort of some of the denominations, for rightly or wrongly, don't perceive them to be authentic.
That's absolutely true, because when I've spoken to large groups of generation, Gen X, Gen Zs, and all these guys, you must remember they are so much more advanced than us.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of technology, computers, innovation. These young people are so more advanced, and we can't introduce them to old wineskin. They've got to be introduced to new wineskins.
Yep.
And I say new mineskins. And we've got to offer them something. And so the one thing I've learned about that generation, those two generations, is that they want to know the truth.
Yeah, exactly.
They want the truth. And if we come with some hyperfluid, religious idea, they're not interested in that. They want to know, does Jesus heal? Does Jesus love? So they want the truth.
Well, and that's what I love about, I've often said, Jesus was the greatest servant leader this world has ever known, the best at grassroots engagement, two things that I love and try to model, the servant leader part of it and grassroots. He was not above anybody. He was out with the people, walking with them. And so I've come to view Jesus as a very dynamic figure. And I think we try to say, well, he's just the Prince of Peace. But for younger people, I'm like, he is the truth and the way and the life. And he is so dynamic. I mean, who is cooler than Jesus?
Absolutely. And so these young men are looking for authenticity, because if you sit down with them, the one word that keeps on coming up in their language is hypocrisy.
Yep.
We don't want hypocrisy. We don't want people to say they're Christians and they're not. And so we have dedicated our lives to invest into as many young men and women as possible, starting with the guy that comes to church, training him, discipling him. Our discipleship programs are awesome, because we're discipling people into and make them aware of the gift they carry. So it's not just the spiritual gifts, but it's the gifts of service. It's that servant heartbeat, the heartbeat to serve a nation. But on the other side of the coin, we've invested a lot of time and resource into getting people off drugs.
Yeah.
And so we have a massive program in California, and about to start it in South Carolina, in Charleston, called The Refuge, where we would take them in, and a lot of people don't realize it. It's the investment of time and energy and resource, and we've seen over 800 young men and women come off drugs and become successful. So we know it works.
Well, and that's what I talk about, is that we do have an epidemic of loneliness.
Yes.
And we had a young man here in Augusta, just unexpectedly, nobody saw it coming, committed suicide this week.
Wow.
And so I do believe we need to minister to that younger generation here in Charleston, but all throughout the world. And they are, they need to be brought to faith, I believe. I believe that's the only way we're going to heal them from addiction, from loneliness, from depression.
And as the church goes, so does the nation.
Exactly.
And so when I lived in Australia, and I want to just speak into Australia for a while, we ended up in a place called Toowoomba. And Toowoomba is inland from Brisbane. The reason why I landed up there, I had a lot to do with Integrity Music, Hosanna Music, years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with Integrity Music. It was a large production company that really focused on Christian music. They were out of Mobile, Alabama. And I had the opportunity to take Ron Canoli and some of the big artists with me on a safari, because that's what I used to be involved in, the safari business, and still run a safari, still take people on safari. And they all came out to Africa. We did this massive safari, and I landed up in Toowoomba because that's where Integrity had an office, and connected with a guy they called Ian Shelton, who had been part of the city for a long while, and started to hear his heart about citywide transformation. And when I heard the word citywide transformation, it's almost like I had a Elizabeth moment. When Elizabeth, the baby, she had this moment where the baby jumped in her womb. Well, when I heard about city transformation, I realized how important it would be to be able to explore that because of the young generation. The Australian young man and woman in that time, they're not a spiritual people. The Australians see themselves as non-spiritual, very cynical, very suspicious. In actual fact, a lot of the Australians, and they're coming out of it, but a lot of Australian people battle with what we call the tall poppy syndrome. So if you're successful, if you're doing well, they'll try and keep you cut down. They'll cut that down. They don't like to speak about that.
I've got friends in Australia, and we talk a lot about that.
Yeah.
And that's to me, I always like to lift people up.
Absolutely.
And to bring people to a higher place. And I have seen that. We witness that here in Augusta, every place. It's just, particularly in lower income neighborhoods, if people try to get out, somebody has said to me one time, it's kind of like a bucket full of crabs. Yeah. When one crab tries to get out, they try to pull him back in.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so fortunately, we started to meet men of God, pastors, leaders in the city, business leaders in the city, political leaders in Australia, members of parliament, that wanted to see a cultural shift, change come to Australia. And nobody really had the answer. And this group of men, these pastors started to meet together, and we started praying together, eating together, building relationship. And over a period of probably about a year, we started having prayer summits, getting out there, spending time. And we realized the thing that was missing, there was a catalyst missing in what we were doing. We were speaking about God to people, but we had no relationship with one another. There was no relationship, there was no intimacy, there was no covenant with each other, but yet we were trying to expound on a God that we didn't truly understand. And what happened out of that is we started to gather more and more momentum as men and women in the city came together and said, our city lies in ruins. What are we going to do as the spiritual leaders that should have the answer for the city? What are we going to do to engage the city? How are we going to engage the city? We've been here for 200 years. Mm-hmm. On every block there's a church. So people have become so accustomed in seeing buildings, but they've never seen the heart of God.
Exactly. Well, that's to me, that's similar here in Augusta. We are the second most churched city in the nation, I believe. We have so many nonprofits, but we still have a 20% poverty rate.
Yep.
And we've got economic prosperity. But just to talk a little bit more about the transformation in Toowoomba, because I'm excited to have you here, because a lot of people say to me, well, what are you going to do about that 20% poverty rate? And I'm like, look, I'm not going to do anything about it. I can't do anything about it, but God can do whatever he wants to do. And the Holy Spirit really helped to transform Toowoomba.
Absolutely. And so if I can just mention 5 things. So we had the highest domestic abuse rate in all of Australia. We had the highest drug rate because all the trucks, it was a big trucking route, so a lot of trucks coming through Toowoomba, drugs. We had prostitution because in Australia, brothels are legal. And so we had like 3 or 4 brothels. We had strip joints, they're legal. We had all sorts of a suicide rate. So we had all the largest high percentage problems in all of Australia, not just in Queensland, but all of Australia. And so as these men of God started to come together, started to pray, started to build relationship, started to ask God for strategy. How do we touch the city? What language? What are we going to have to do? How are we going to introduce a new wineskin model to a city that's been so accustomed to be beaten down? And all I can say is as men started to come together, pray, seek the Lord, we started to realize within the mix of these men, There were business people that were very, very, very successful. There was the wealth. There was innovation. We had pastors with all sorts of skills. We had counselors that came together, and we thought, how are we going to do this? I mean, we can pray. You know, David didn't just sit on the hillside praying and playing his harp. He actually got up, took 5 stones and a sling, and killed Goliath.
Yep.
And so we had to step into the city, and we engaged the city. We engaged businesses. We engaged schools. We engaged universities. We started to have a worship event in our city once a year called the City Gospel Festival, which changed and became the Easter Fest Gospel, where worship, Christian worship, everywhere, in the pubs, in the bars, in the lounges. We closed down the city. There was worship going on. There was prayer. There was all sorts of things going on for our city. But it attracted economy. It attracted 50,000 people. We had camping sites. We had caravanners come. So there was this all this activity around unity. But the one thing I would say is that it wasn't just men meeting together to discuss the problem. It was men coming together and literally repenting to one another. Mm-hmm. Pastors coming together and saying, you know, I've hurt you. I'm a Pentecostal. I've been rude to you. And it's men that came around and literally sat on the floor and cried out to God for weeks on end, repenting to one another, washing each other's feet, because we believe for the city to be healed, we had to be healed. We had to walk in repentance to one another to see our city healed. And that's how we saw citywide transformation. When we became totally vulnerable and transparent to one another, the city could trust us.
It's interesting. I just read a book called Practicing the Way.
Yes.
That talks about in the book that you can't give something to somebody
yes.
that you don't have yourself. And so I thought about that, and we've discussed, you know, I overcame cancer
Sure.
a couple of years ago, but I thought, and my role in Augusta is to help continue
Sure.
to try to heal this city.
Yes.
And to do what was done in Toowoomba here
Yes.
with the group that we've got meeting together, the one church group. But I thought, you know, Lord, in order for me to really help heal,
Yes.
you had to heal me first.
Absolutely.
And so, and just to take me down to, you know, to just break me down so I can rise again.
You know, we had a guy living in our city that was he was a billionaire, a very, very successful man because he worked hard. And a lot of those men living in our city were wealthy, successful business people. That we never saw the transfer of that wealth into our city. But until they understood, until they realized that the spiritual leaders of the city, the pastors and the leaders of the city, were in unity, were engaging each other, that they started to spend the wealth in the city. For example, the one guy, Bonhoeffer, a very interesting last name,
Yeah.
actually built an airport in the city of Toowoomba. You can now
Wow.
fly from Toowoomba to Sydney or anywhere down the coast from Toowoomba. In the past, you had to get in a car and do a 2.5-hour drive to an airport. He built an airport. The whole economy of the city changed because they had their own airport. Because he came around these men, realized that the pastors were serious, there was interaction, there was unity amongst the leaders, and immediately we saw the wealth of the righteous, not the unrighteous, the wealth of the righteous come into the coffers of the city because they now saw a workable model.
And that's as you say, I mean, for church politics are every bit as bad as governmental politics.
Absolutely.
But I do believe the same thing is happening here in Augusta. It's walking it like you talk it. It's like,
That's
well,
it.
the city needs to come together across racial lines, all lines of difference. But until the churches model that,
Yes.
it sort of rings hollow if you're just telling people that, but you're not doing it yourself.
You know, the word is very clear. It says, show me your works and I'll show you my faith. Faith and works go hand in hand. We can't have faith, and that's what we've seen. We've seen a lot of faith works, but we've never seen any works. No substantial practical application on the ground. That's not going to mean a hill of beans. But when we put our money where our mouth is, and really businessmen, you know, I've spent a lot of time with great businessmen around the world, and one of the critical things they speak about, the criticisms, is that I've been to church all my life and all my church wants is my money.
Yeah.
But there's no incentive. There's no, what's the program? What's the assignment? What are we actually doing with this wealth? There was a guy that came to a church, a very, very dear friend of mine, and he was wanting to put a substantial amount in the offering. He just felt, I wanted to invest, wanted to put it in, and the amount was over £1 million, not rands, pounds. This was in England, in Scotland. Came to the church, and when the leader got up to take the offering, had more of an excuse. He was apologizing about raising £500. And this guy was sitting there and thinking, if I gave this man this money, if that's his mindset, he doesn't have a vision for his city, doesn't have a vision for the nation, doesn't have a heartbeat for his city, doesn't have compassion for the poor, but he has this very bad attitude about, we need your money. He said, I couldn't give my money. We've got to create a mindset in the heartbeat of the city that we want to invest into the city, but we've got to keep our language. We've got to have a kingdom language. God's a king. He's not a pauper, and he's not a beggar.
It's interesting. We started a prayer breakfast my first day in office 19 years ago, this past December. But a black Presbyterian minister that's a good friend of mine, Melvin Lowry, said something that stuck with me that first year. He said, we labor under a mindset of scarcity when we serve a God of abundance.
Absolutely.
And I think that's, in Augusta, we labor under a mindset of scarcity when we have abundant resources. We just haven't sequenced them together in the right way. And I think the church unifying has to be the thing that happens first.
Absolutely. So when the church unified, when all the pastors, now you must remember, we had Lutheran pastors, Baptist pastors, Presbyterian, we had Seventh-day Adventists, we had all the Pentecostal guys, Assembly of God, you name it all. When all these men, 60 of these men, came together and they bowed their knee to the Lord Jesus and said, we're here to serve the city. We're here to get healed. We're here to serve each other. We're here to love each other. We're here to wash each other's feet. But really, we want to serve our city. When that started to happen, it peeled back the resistance of the city. It peeled that back. Once people realized that the church was actually doing what they said they would do, it peeled things back. So the prostitution stopped, closed. The prostitutes, the madams of those brothels got healed, got delivered, and they became born again. They received Christ. They became believers. So the brothels shut down. The strip joints shut down. Those young women got saved. We had a young lady, Ian Shelton's daughter, that went into those strip joints and started to teach those young women about their identity in God. They got saved. They got healed. Those strip joints closed down. Domestic abuse zeroed out. So what we saw was the church changing the atmosphere, being the catalyst in the city. And the other thing, whether we like it or not, is the economy. When the economy started to change, and the hotel owners, Airbnb owners, bed and breakfast owners, when they saw 50,000 people coming to the city, and now suddenly all the accommodation, people are booking accommodation, rental cars, restaurants, they couldn't keep up. When that starts to happen, it has a flow down effect. And suddenly it's grassroots. People at grassroots level are being affected, and the guys that are, we call it the top-down effect or the bottom-up. So bottom-up evangelism started to take place, grassroots evangelism, the city started to get healed, and then our top guys, like, for example, our members of parliament, the mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, all these different people, politicians started to say, gee whiz, Toowoomba is a regional city. It's regional.
Yeah.
It's not a city by the coast where you have tourism. It's a regional city that's based around the economy from farming and agriculture. And suddenly they started to say, what's going on there? Well, the pastors have come together. Unity has come amongst leadership. That offset a whole lot of different things.
And that's what I often tell people is I'm like, okay, I can't do anything about what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
That's above my pay grade. But I can make my city the best it can possibly be. And I feel like, I started that 20 some odd years ago, but I'm still doing it 20 years later.
Wow.
Because I believe that if change is going to come in our nation and healing is going to come, it has to start at the grassroots level and it has to go from city to city.
Yes. And I want to just say this. I want to encourage every single leader or pastor or ministry leader or, any person in ministry in the city, it's going to take time, but at least get the ball rolling. And it starts with me. It starts with you. It starts with an individual. A little snowflake falling on a mountaintop can become a massive avalanche. We don't want an avalanche of destruction, but we need an avalanche of unity. And so with my background being that, come out of a neo-Nazi background, being a mercenary, getting saved, realizing the value in people. So every time I meet somebody, my philosophy is that person carries something I need. Every single person.
Exactly.
And I put value on that. And I build a value around that person's ability and gifting. And that's where it starts. So if we can start to look at this city as a city of great opportunity, innovation is in the city. There's a lot of innovation.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of young people in the city. That's where your innovation lies.
Exactly.
And if we can get some fathers, you see, to me, it's about leaders becoming fathers, leaders becoming mothers and fathers, spiritual mothers and fathers, leaders becoming spiritual parents to raise a generation of sons and daughters, not orphans, because orphans demand, sons receive. So if we can get them to understand, I'm here to impart into your life, I'm here to disciple you. We've got to disciple our cities well. And so all I can say, Deke, is that I saw a move of God in Toowoomba, and it wasn't hard, it wasn't religious, pounding the pavement, hard-hearted religion. It was a group of men that fell in love with Jesus, fell in love with their God, loved one another well, and then fell in love with their city.
Well, that's a good place to close out. But as we're getting here towards the end, I always like to ask people two questions. One, yes. Where can my viewers and listeners find you?
They can go straight to my website, which is very easy, www.davidmcdonald, my name, David McDonald with his MC, .ministries.com. So it's davidmcdonaldministries.com. You can go straight there, or they can email me. I think I'm a little bit more of a communicator, and if you want to email me, it's davidmcdonald388@gmail.com, and I'd love to hear from them.
I'll tell you, it's funny. I wrote a best-selling book a couple of years ago. I put my cell phone number in the back of the book. Only one person has ever called it, because I think everybody's like, nobody would be crazy enough to put their yes. cell phone number in a book. Yes. But I agree with you. It's all about lines of communications. Yes. So my last question is, on a daily basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
I've learned to consistently meditate on my salvation. And I'm thankful. I'm very grateful for my salvation. So every morning I spend at least 5 to 15 minutes just thanking God for my salvation. And that is the gunpowder in my life that causes me to do what I do. The fact that God chose me before the foundation of the world, chose me, separated me from the world, and brought me into this beautiful covenant, that keeps me smiling. That keeps me going.
Well, I will tell you, Pastor McDonald, thank you for being an amazing guest. And to the people of Augusta, if they can do it in Toowoomba, or if God can do it in Toowoomba, we can do it here too. So that's all the time we've got. Dropping the mic, and we are out. Hey guys, thanks for listening to or watching the Changemaker podcast today. Greatly appreciate it. If you're listening and you want to see the video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Deke Copenhaver. That's pretty easy to remember, I would think. But really, we also want to remind you to like, subscribe, rate across all platforms, download. And if you're looking for a coach, a speaker, or anything, you know where to find me. Just email me at me@dekecopenhaver.com. And thanks so much for listening.